Hello, everyone. My name is Tiana Davis, and I am the Community Engagement Assistant with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's civil and human rights education and enforcement agency. With me today as co-host is Kyla Hannington, the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Office of Human Rights. Our office investigates complaints of discrimination, fights human trafficking around the region, ensures all people can access county government services in the language of their preference, and builds programming that provides opportunities for social justice engagement and learning, like this one. Lunch and Learn, our new series with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, debuted earlier this summer, and we are delighted to have you with us today for a special discussion on advocating for Black maternal health featuring Asiah Gayfield, soon to be Ph.D., whose research includes work on Black women and prenatal care, and Dr. Doee Kitessa, a general obstetrician and gynecologist and a professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. Asiah Gayfield is a doctoral candidate at the University of Maryland who specializes in demography and stratification. Her research focuses on Black women and girls, which led to her research on Black women and prenatal care. Soon to be Dr. Gayfield also taught Intro to Sociology and Sociology of Gender at the University of Maryland. Dr. Doee Kitessa received her medical degree from the University of Maryland School of Medicine and completed her residency training in obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Maryland. She went on to complete a Global Women's Health Fellowship at the University of Maryland, where she worked in Rwanda, partnering with faculty at the University of Rwanda to expand residency training in obstetrics and gynecology and supporting programs to increase access to care by OBGYN specialists. Dr. Kitessa is passionate about the care of patients from underserved communities and marginalized groups and is the director of the program on diversity, inclusion, and women's empowerment. In this role, she works with department leadership, faculty, and staff to apply a health equity lens to areas of clinical care, education, and research to better care for, engage with, and advocate for the communities we serve. So welcome to both of you. So the theme for today's discussion is advocating for Black maternal health. Can you both share how your experience relates to this topic?
Sure. I guess I'll go first.
Go ahead, Asiah.
Hi, I'm Asiah. So I am a researcher, and so my experience relates to this topic in that I am a part of the process where I do the research, right? So I'm looking at, I'm primarily a quantitative researcher. So I'm looking at trends over time. I'm looking at data around prenatal care, infant mortality, birth outcomes to better understand what's happening so that people who are advocating on the ground, so that doctors, so that hospital systems can have the best information about what we've done in the past and what we should be doing or how we can change in the future to improve maternal health.
Thanks so much for having me. So I'm a clinician, and mostly as a clinician and educator. So that's kind of my lens and approach to advocating for women, particularly Black women and women for underserved communities. And so the way I see that role and kind of carry out that role often is in the day-to-day care of patients. I think one of the most important things is recognizing patients' humanity, our patients and our families. And trying to get to know them as people, as whole people, with the history of things that they've been through in their life that impact how they interact with me as a physician, with the entire healthcare team, with kind of the institutional structure of healthcare. And so I think it's really important having that understanding and trying to get to know our patients, even sometimes, even if it's a very short-lived, limited interaction sometimes, how important that is for building trust, particularly for Black women, given the historical racism that exists within the healthcare system here in the United States. In addition to that, I'm an educator, so I teach medical students, I teach residents, and this is so important as we train our next generation of physicians discussions and conversations about health equity, inequity, racism, those just were not part of the conversation when I was a medical student. And so that is a tremendous change for the better. And I think we learn a lot from our students too. And I hope to, in my work, to also educate them not only to be technically good physicians and have the excellent medical knowledge and skills, but also to be very humanistic physicians who meet patients where they are, understand how their life, their families, their life circumstances impact their health, impact how they see us, and in turn, so we can really partner and work together with our patients to improve health and health outcomes.
Okay, nice. So to kick us off, Asiah, when you were a guest on here previously, you talked to us about the weathering and Geronimus's theory. Can you discuss that a little bit?
Sure. So you're referring to Geronimus, who's a researcher who has come up with a theory called the weathering hypothesis, right? And so the weathering hypothesis is this idea, and we've done a lot of research on it, where when we're looking at the gap in birth outcomes between Black women and white women, we see a very persistent gap. Even when Black women and white women are the same age, they have the same level of socioeconomic status, they have the same education level, we see time and time and again that Black women are having worse outcomes, right? And so the weathering hypothesis kind of gives us a way of understanding this. And basically, the weathering hypothesis is that these persistent racial outcomes are due to the impact of stress, mainly racial stress, on Black women's bodies, right? So when we look at the age distribution of infant mortality, right, Black women are actually more likely to experience an infant death when they're, in their late 20s compared to when they're younger, right? And so part of this is that if you are waiting to have a baby, right, which is what we're told to do, we're told to wait until you get married, wait until you have an education, wait until you're done with your PhD, right? Wait. But what we see is that the longer you wait, the more stress you've encountered and the more wear and tear that causes on your body, right? And so what we're seeing is that on a cellular level, Black women are aging faster, right? And so the research for this is actually really fascinating. They do cheek swabs, and they test saliva, and they see it's, on the molecular level, right? We have something in our DNA called a telomere, and every time your DNA cells replicate themselves, right, which is a natural process of aging, a chunk of your telomere is kind of chopped off, right? And so what they were finding is that Black women were aging cellularly faster than white women, and that this is what is really driving, and this is due to the accumulation of stress, right? So anything that you're experiencing, poverty, um, stress at work, right? Things that we know are more likely to affect Black people, that has an effect on your body. And then when you go to give birth, it makes you more likely to experience an adverse birth outcome.
Okay. So 2 weeks ago, we interviewed an author named Lyle Liverpool. She had a book called Systemic: How Racism is Making Us Sick. And so in that, the book opens with a story of a woman who had a traumatic birth. I think she passed during that. And then she went on to talk about celebrities who have had traumatic births, Serena Williams, Beyonce, etc. And so these are stories we're hearing over and over again. What sort of changes, if any, are you seeing in the health landscape?
Yeah, I think one of the major things in the health landscape and healthcare delivery, one is inclusion of these discussions and conversations in our routine. And that's a big part of my work here and what I do and what many people do in various institutions throughout the country is incorporating and asking these questions, talking about health equity, inequity, and incorporating it in what we do every day. And so as an example, when we have a complex outcome or something that happen, even if everything went well and mom and baby are great. When we are on labor and delivery, we review and go through kind of a systematic, like what are things we did well, what are things we could have done better. And one of the things we've done here is incorporated, did health equity, inequity have an impact on this case? Could it have changed the outcome? We have case reviews with like a health equity context focus. When we do, what are called M&Ms, where we review cases where maybe there was a negative outcome, an evaluation of was there something specific about this patient, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, ability, or various other factors that may have played into or contributed to what happened in this case. So I think these are some of the ways in which we start to ask those questions to kind of get to the heart of, what could we have done differently? The vast majority of people go into healthcare because they want to help people. And we don't realize what our blinders are, what our biases are. We all have them just by nature of being human being, living in the United States of America with the history of racism, discrimination for various groups. And we have to acknowledge that we all have that in us, being human beings. And so we have to feel comfortable to have those conversations and not be defensive about it. So incorporating these conversations into our regular routine kind of helps to start to take that away, where people don't feel that they're being accused or attacked. We're just trying to make things better for our patients, for all of us.
That's really interesting. I'm learning something, and I'm so glad to hear that. Because there's research that shows that, like, you'll survey doctors and they don't understand the social determinants of health, or they don't understand health equity, or they don't know that their patient population is more likely to have more complicated outcomes or issues because a lot of times, and I actually worked at the Association of American Medical Colleges a long time ago, before grad school, and they were having these conversations about, should doctors be learning about these things? And absolutely yes, right? Because that affects your patient population. And so you should know, if you're working at a healthcare center in an underprivileged neighborhood, you should understand the things around you that are affecting patient's health, because it makes it harder to treat your patients, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, we still have a long way to go. By no means are we there yet, of course. And I think there's a lot of emphasis on our learners and our students, and needs to be more emphasis on our educators and clinicians who have been in practice for a longer period of time. And so I think that's one area that really, I think, is an area we need to work on and improve. But yeah, I see a change from when I was a learner and a student, very much.
That's great.
This is so great. And I one of the questions I had was basically the shifting landscape. And I'm hearing that. And the thing is, I have to feel like, but I feel like this is accurate, that we're not just having the same conversation over and over again. That is happening, but there is also change happening. Is that too optimistic, or do you see that?
I guess from the research side, I don't think it's too optimistic to say that change is happening, right? So when you look at the graph, like, I wish I could put up a graph of, the difference in infant mortality over time, right? It is decreasing, right? And it has been decreasing, but what we still see is that gap, right? Between Black women and white women. And it's been like 2.3, 2.4, 2.5% difference for a very long time, right? And, sometimes you have to have those conversations over and over, right? Like, when we're talking about physicians, it is really hard to get change among physicians, right? Because, these are some of the smartest people on the planet, right? They have gone through years of education, and it is really hard to get through that training. And so sometimes you might have to have the conversation over and over, right? But it's also good that we're starting at, the learner level. And I think also what I'm noticing with students at the undergraduate level is they're coming in with so much knowledge about the world, about what's going on around them. They're, sometimes we don't want to bring up certain topics in class. We don't want to approach things. And the students are like, no, let's go there. Let's talk about what's going on in the world. And I think that Black maternal health is having a moment, is being talked about. And so students are hearing about it. And also students may have experienced it, right? So maybe not themselves, but they might have a family member, they might have someone in their community, right? Or someone they look up to, like Serena Williams, Beyonce. The Olympics are on right now, literally, right? Allison Felix, right? Like, we have all of these people who are Black women superstars who, they may have heard about this. And so they're wanting to know. And I think that that's also a part of it, is that it's also coming in through pop culture, through the news. And so people are hearing about it. And so by the time you get to medical school, it's not an unfamiliar conversation to talk about health equity, right? It's not an unfamiliar conversation to talk about equality, right? Like, our students nowadays are the students who might have been to a march, right? Like, they might have protested about any number of social issues that have affected them. So it's not unlikely that by the time they get into medical school, they want a class on health equity. They want to know how to treat people and how to do better, because like Dr. Kitessa said, you don't go to medical school because you don't want to help people, right? So I think the frame of what it means to help people is shifting, right? And, it's very encouraging to see that with younger people, but also we have to know that with older people, that change might not be there yet, right? And so you might have to have the conversation multiple times. You might have to say, okay, guys, we're going to read a book about it. And if you don't get it, we're going to read another book about it, right? Geronimus actually just came out with a book called Weathering. It talks about not just Black maternal health, but how weathering is a process, how stress is killing all of us, right? Particularly if you are disadvantaged and you're exposed to more stress, right? And so that's something that doctors should know about, the role of stress in their patients' lives and outcomes, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. I totally agree with everything Asiah said. And a couple things I would add to that. I think that I agree. I am optimistic, I think, because of the next generation. I think that's coming behind me. But also, I think some important points to think about and to understand is, I think, a big part of that too has to do with the increasing diversity in medicine among the physician population. We're still not there yet, but in many medical schools, from a gender perspective, more than half are women. So I think that changes the landscape of physicians in this country, or will. I think you see large donors giving grants to medical schools so that students do not have to pay tuition. I think that is going to have a huge impact on diversity in medicine, so that people from underserved backgrounds who maybe thought, I can't go to medical school because I can't afford it, or I have to take $200,000 worth of loans, that they may, who are, excellent students, will reconsider applying to medical school. And so I think, that's something we have to look at too. If you look at from a Black maternal health perspective, or just disparities in healthcare in general in the United States, 5% of physicians in this country are Black, but we represent 13% of the population. That's a huge disparity. And there's research that shows that, for example, babies in the NICU, they are less likely to die. Black babies are less likely to die if they are cared for by a Black physician. And we don't have a lot of data on this for other specialties, but I would posit to say that might be very similar when you look at other specialties as well. And there's a shared commonality understanding of experience that kind of breaks down barriers, I think, for patients, makes them feel more comfortable, more likely to return for follow-up, because they feel like they're heard, listened to. And so I think that's an area that we are starting to see some change and need to continue to work on. I've seen a change here at University of Maryland School of Medicine, the percentage of our medical student population that come from underrepresented backgrounds. And if our doctors are a greater reflection of the diversity of our country, then that can be a huge factor that not only improves outcomes from a patient care perspective, but also brings diversity of perspectives, opinions to the conversation when we are discussing patients and patient care. And I've been in many situations where, as a student, as a resident, when I was a trainee, I don't know, I didn't recognize or I didn't feel comfortable speaking up. Whereas now as a faculty member, I feel much more comfortable speaking up and approaching situations to educate patients when I feel that maybe we're talking about patients in a way that's not appropriate or not considering factors about a patient that are going to impact their care. And so the greater diversity that we achieve in our physician population brings those perspectives. I'm a Black woman, I'm a child of immigrants. Like, these all impact the experiences that I've had in my life and ways in which I can relate to, and also questions that I ask, things that I think about for patients who might be of similar backgrounds as me, that someone who doesn't look like me just may not know. And so that's really important too as well.
And it enhances horizontal learning, right? Like, all of your colleagues are better at their job for having had you around, for having had you speak up, right? I think that we sometimes discount the horizontal learning that happens, right? Vertical learning is, from a professor to a student. That horizontal learning of having a Black woman in the room, in the classroom, on the team, really does help everyone, right? And so having that diversity of perspective improves everyone's education, improves everyone's skill and ability.
This is great. We have actually a number of questions from viewers already. So I'm going to take a few minutes and share some viewer questions, and then Tiana, I'll hand it back to you. So I'm going to put them up on the screen, and I'll read them as they come in as well. So here's one. It says, wondering, has there been any study or research done on African American women and infertility and or miscarriages within the theme of the cells aging because of racism or stress?
That's a really good question. Off the top of my head, I can't think of very many. Fertility, infertility, and also miscarriages are actually really, really hard to study from a quantitative standpoint because we actually don't collect data on it, right? So I believe we have estimates of how many women might miscarry in a given year, but we don't necessarily have hard data on it. I think that one thing, honestly, that's missing from the research is a lot of qualitative research. So asking people questions about their experiences with infertility, with miscarriages, with other parts of the process to becoming parents, right? I think that the literature really is focused on birth and birth outcomes because it's very easy to track, right? It's something that the government tracks. And so it's very easy to do research on that. It's much harder to do research on the other processes that go along with that. So yeah, that's my answer.
Yeah, I agree. Like, we don't really have research specifically on that. And it is hard to track because we don't to do research on because we don't track that data. One of the things I would, not specifically to African American women, but stress and pregnancy outcomes, there's kind of like stories of things that we hear. For example, pregnant people who work for certain companies who don't get modifications in their, work assignments that can increase stress during pregnancy, have higher rates of miscarriage, pregnancy loss. There is data among physicians. So physicians who are in surgical specialties that are more demanding, stressful, have higher rates of infertility. So it's interesting, like if you look at certain populations that maybe have more stress, there are higher rates of infertility among women who are in surgical specialties compared to women who are not in surgical specialties. So it's interesting. We haven't studied it like, Asiah has said, but I wouldn't be surprised necessarily, just because we see how stressful situations in other populations can impact infertility and miscarriage.
That's fascinating. I did not know that. That is so fascinating.
I'm just going to put up, we've got a couple more. So we've got one from Denise Stewart, who says, with the impact of trauma on the birthing mother, is this also an impact on the child's, excuse me, a child's referral for special education and progression during primary school years?
So in sociology, we have something that we call the long arm of childhood, right? And so in an indirect way, it can, right? So birthing, children who are, I guess, are birthed in situations that may be difficult situations, we can see that there are other outcomes that's linked to that, right? So I just read some research about like chronic illness, right? Later development in childhood or in adulthood of chronic illnesses, things like that, right? But this might be a better question for the doctor.
Yeah. I'm not actually familiar with research on that and data on that myself. I'm not sure if it's really been studied to see what are outcomes. As an OBGYN, I don't take care of children. So some of this data I'm not as familiar with, but I can imagine, stress impacts children in so many ways. Specifically about this question, I'm not as familiar.
All right, thank you. I just want to I know we have two more questions. So one is, at what point in pregnancy do complications most often happen, and what can women do to educate themselves and have necessary conversations with healthcare providers?
Sure. Complications can really happen at any point in pregnancy. There are different sort of complications that can occur. One of the most common ones that we see here in the United States is complications related to high blood pressure or hypertension. There's a disease of pregnancy called preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure, also urine protein. The reason why we worry about preeclampsia is it can lead to something called eclampsia when you have a seizure. It's probably one of the most common causes of complications in pregnancy. Usually it's later in pregnancy after 20 weeks. But there are all sorts of various complications that can occur. It also depends on people's medical problems. So if a pregnant person has certain medical problems, that can increase the risk of complications. So it's really important, I think, to try and decrease the risk of complications. One is if you're thinking about becoming pregnant, especially if you have medical problems, to meet with your OBGYN even before you decide to become pregnant, if possible, because then you can go through those medical problems with your doctor, make sure that they're as controlled as possible before you get pregnant. Sometimes that's not always possible, and that's totally understandable. If when you do present for care, making sure to, your doctor reviews all of your medical problems, talks with you about how these medical problems can potentially impact your pregnancy and what you can do about it, whether you need to see another specialist to help manage those medical problems to decrease the risk of complications. And then there are some complications that are just not preventable. I like to tell patients sometimes it's just bad luck. Pregnancy sometimes just innately and of itself most of the time goes smoothly for most patients and you don't have any issues. But, we do have higher rates of complications in pregnancy in the United States for various reasons. And sometimes it's sort of bad luck too. And so some of them are things that can come up, like heavy bleeding or hemorrhage after delivery is one of the major complications that can occur. So these are some of the things that can happen. And what you can do is, make sure you you review your medical problems with your OBGYN during your pregnancy, before pregnancy, if possible. And also trying to make sure that you feel comfortable with your OBGYN or midwife or whoever you're seeing for pregnancy care. In this area that we live in, there are lots of options in a lot of ways for healthcare. And so, it's important that you feel comfortable, that you feel like you trust your doctor or midwife who's caring for you during your pregnancy, so that you feel comfortable bringing any issues or concerns and you feel that you're going to be heard, you're going to be listened to, and you feel comfortable that you're going to be taken care of.
This is great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time too, because we've got this wonderful chatty viewers, and we have one more question from the viewers, and then Tiana, it's all you. So the last question we have for now is from Denise Stewart, who's wondering, does athletic stress, and I think this question may have come in when we were talking about the Olympics, because it came in a little bit ago, but does athletic stress have any impact on the health of a fetus or baby?
Actually, we know that for people who are athletes or regularly exercise, they are totally safe to continue to regularly exercise during pregnancy. And so you really don't have to change any of your habits. If you have a disorder where you're maybe excessively exercising and not an appropriate weight, or you're underweight, that can have an impact on pregnancy. But people who are athletes or regularly exercise, engage in, physical activity, continue that during pregnancy, no matter what it is. If you weren't like an athlete exercising before pregnancy, probably don't say, I'm going to run a marathon or, start heavy lifting, weightlifting. You may not want to start that during pregnancy, but regular exercise athletes, keep doing what you're doing during pregnancy.
Yeah. And I think with some of the athletes that we mentioned, like Allison Felix or Serena Williams, I know like Serena Williams, she actually had a pre-existing health condition. And so it was not something that came out of the blue. It was not something that was exacerbated by, any physical activity that she was doing during pregnancy. But what her conflict was is that she felt something in her body and she knew the issue was happening. And she felt like the nurses weren't listening to her, right? And she, that was the point of contention. She kind of had to argue with the nurses, like, no, something's wrong. They're like, no, sit down, no. And she's like, no, but you don't understand. Something is wrong, right? And then I think with Allison Felix, she actually had, I believe she had preeclampsia, and it emerged like right at the end of her pregnancy, kind of out of the blue. And it's just like, Dr. Kitessa said that sometimes stuff just, even for the healthiest among us, right? Olympic athletes who train or in peak physical condition, who have, doctors on top of medical providers monitoring them, things just happen in pregnancy, right? Like it is a medical marvel. It's a human marvel that we are able to grow other people in our bodies. And sometimes that just puts some stress and comes along with some complications, and no one caused it, and it just happens. But that's why it's important, like Dr. Kitessa said, to make sure you're comfortable with your doctor or provider, and then also that your family is, whoever's in the room with you while you're giving birth, make sure they're comfortable. Make sure it's the person who's going to stand up and say something when maybe you can't speak for yourself.
And I will add that point is so important, that having someone who's going to be there and advocate you. Being pregnant, being a patient in the hospital is a very vulnerable position to be in. And I think probably most people on this call have either been in the hospital before or had a loved one in the hospital before. I know I have. Mm-hmm. And if you've ever been in that situation, it's unfortunate that sometimes we really do have to push and advocate. I've been in that role before. And it really was very eye-opening for me as a physician. Because I recognized how empowered I felt, and I was, with my knowledge as a physician, my family member was getting care in the hospital I work. So everyone knew I was an attending physician here. And it really has, that understanding has really had an impact on how I provide care and interact with family members and support persons, because most people don't have that background. And it's something I really recognize how important that is, to have someone who's going to, advocate for you, because you may not be able to advocate for yourself when you're in a vulnerable position as a patient.
Absolutely, yes.
So to follow up on that, what options exist for people who are looking for that extra support? Like we know doulas. What else is out there, and like what do these different types of support offer, so to speak?
Yes. Oh, do you want to go ahead, Asiah?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say doulas are wonderful. And if you have access to a doula, sometimes cost can be somewhat prohibitive. But in the state of Maryland, Medicaid does cover doula care. And so a doula is someone who is your support person during your pregnancy, during your labor and delivery, during postpartum. And I always like to point out, we should really be covering doulas so much more than we are, because there is so much research to support doula care. Doula care improves pregnancy outcomes. It decreases mortality. It decreases the risk of preterm labor and preterm birth, and it saves the healthcare system millions of dollars. And there's lots of research to support that in cost analysis models. And so if you're not sure where to find a doula, go online. There are lots of nonprofits, if you can't afford a doula, that will provide doula care free of services. There are lots of insurance companies that will provide funding for doula care. And so it's really nice to have someone who understands. They're not necessarily medically trained, so they may not be a nurse or a healthcare provider in any way, but they are familiar with birth and supporting people through the birth process. And I always big plug for midwifery care. Even I'm a physician, OBGYN. I have worked with midwives my entire career. And as a resident, I was trained by midwives. So if you are someone who doesn't have a lot of complex medical problems, not everyone is a candidate to be cared for by a midwife. And a midwife is someone who is trained to take care of people during pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and they do some gynecologic care too. And they have more time in a lot of ways, and the structure and kind of some of the foundations of midwifery care are slightly different, but still you get evidence-based pregnancy care just like you would get with an OBGYN. And so if that's something that interests you, finding out, where you have midwives and seeing if you're a candidate for a midwife. Many places have birthing classes to familiarize you and your support persons in your life with what pregnancy, labor, delivery might look like, what sort of techniques for pain control, what to sort of expect in the whole process. And talk to your friends and family members about what their experiences are like. The vast majority of people, they remember everything about their birth experience. I've learned that being an OBGYN for the last 11 years. Yes, I'm sure you have too, Asiah. Like, people remember the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. Yes, they remember. And use your community also as a resource. I think that's really important. Like, I've done global health work, and birth in the United States is often very isolating in a way that it's not in other parts of the world. And so I think finding your community, whether it's a family member, your friends, your neighbors, I think we need to kind of break down these walls and barriers of talking about pregnancy, complications, miscarriage. 20% of pregnancies end in miscarriage. Miscarriage is very common, yet we don't talk about it enough. And so kind of breaking down those walls so we have these conversations You know, there shouldn't be any stigma about it. I'm very open about my pregnancy and my sort of birth and my experience. It's a very different one being an OBGYN, getting, delivering where I worked and cared for by, nurses and people I'd known for a long time. But I think it's really important to just talk about that with people that you know.
Yeah. And also, I would add that if you feel moved by what we're talking about or what you've seen in the news, you can do doula training, right? I have heard, when I tell people what I study, so many women have told me, I'm training to be a doula. I'm learning to do it, right? And that's something that a way that you can be a part of the community, right? That you can be a part of someone else's birthing community is to get that training and then show up for other women in that way. Because that's definitely something, if we want every woman to be able to have a doula in birth, we're going to need to train a lot of doulas. Mm-hmm. And so, that's absolutely one way for people who are, hear the stories, the horror stories about Black women and their birth outcomes. That is a way to have an impact, a very big impact. So I encourage anyone who's, curious or wants a way to do more or to get involved to absolutely look into doula training.
Yeah. And I want to say, going back to the word advocate, I think so often, at least in kind of my sphere, people think about advocating means going to the legislature, there's so many ways to advocate. And this is a great one that, I think you're mentioning, Asiah, is, if you have an experience and you want to share that and translate kind of your experience into advocating, becoming a doula is a great way. I think of advocating, there are so many levels. And sometimes it's that one-on-one interactions that you have with people in which you can advocate for them. And so I think that's really important that we all kind of have a role to play, and there are different ways in which you can advocate and improve outcomes for people.
Okay. I want to go back to a previous answer you guys gave about, which information you don't collect. Are you guys finding it, as a practitioner, as a researcher, are you guys finding women are a little more hesitant to give you information, now that we're in a time where, maybe people are being more careful about what apps they use to track their ovulation, their menstruation, things like that? Are people still just as open with you guys, or?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? Because I think I share some of the same hesitancy around data collection and apps. I don't collect data on an individual level. I use data that is collected by hospitals and government entities, right? So my data comes from birth records, right? So it isn't a concern with my data. I think that I can definitely understand why some women would not want to give out that information. I think that when you are doing research, though, you have a responsibility to safeguard that information. And it's a much different process from an app, right? Anyone can kind of create an app and put it on the internet and take someone's data. But when you do research, especially when you are a university affiliated researcher, you go through something called the institutional review board, right? And so my university, if I say I want to go out and I want to collect information from humans, and I say I'm collecting birth information, I'm going to ask people about their birth experience, the university is going to grill me on, okay, so what are you asking? How are you getting this data? How are you storing it? What are you going to do with it after you're done? Right? Like there is, I would get in a lot of trouble if I was sharing data in ways that I had not agreed to and also had not informed my research subjects about, right? So when you do research, there's something called informed consent, right? So we have to tell you exactly what we're going to ask you, why we're asking it, and what we plan to do with it, right? And so if I think that absolutely people should be weary of what they're telling people, what they're giving people. But if someone is doing real legitimate research, they should be able to tell you and give you a document that says exactly what they're going to do with your information, how they're collecting it, how they're analyzing it, where they're going to share it, where they're storing it, right? And I think that in this day and age, I know that I personally, as a researcher, take data collection and data storage very seriously. And so I think, you know, on the other side, though, anecdotally, when I tell people what I research, they are very eager to tell me their stories, right? Like, I've heard some birth stories, right? I mean, even the women in my family, like, I never imagined my aunts would sit me down and tell me their birth stories, but I've heard them. I think that, you know, for a lot of women, a lot of things, not a lot of things, but, you know, you were, like Dr. Kitessa said, you remember the good, you remember the bad. A lot of times you don't have anyone to talk to about it, right? So what I found is that people are very eager to tell me a lot of things. And, you know, sometimes it's just, hey, I'm a researcher, I study birth outcomes. It's like, oh, well, let me tell you about my birth outcomes, right? And I'm not even collecting data. I'm just, you know, trying to get my dinner, right? But, you know, I think that that's a good thing, right? We should be having these conversations. We should be talking about it, the good and the bad, because we don't want, you know, a lot of women go into this not knowing what could happen, not knowing what it's going to be. And so you need to know that, like, things can happen when you're giving birth, embarrassing things, painful things, right? It's not going to be, you know, we kind of hype up this birthing moment. It's like, this is going to be the best moment of your life, and you're going to be changed, and you're going to feel so good, and your baby's going to be here. And it's like, sometimes that's not how it happens, right? And so I think it, you know, everyone should absolutely be concerned about how their information and their data is being used. But also, I do think that a lot of people are eager to talk about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think one of the things, being a clinician and taking care of patients, given the nature and history of what's happened to many populations in this country, especially for Black people in this country, with regard to their health and research and healthcare, there has been mistreatment, there has been harm, and we have to acknowledge that, and that very much shapes how patients interact with doctors. And for me as a physician, for any physician, being able to talk to patients, and it's important that patients feel comfortable to share information with me when I ask questions, because I won't be able to properly take care of them if I don't get that information. So then it's my obligation to build trust in the best way that I can. And sometimes, because of what has happened, trauma in patients' lives that have happened, or trauma to their family member in the past, they are reluctant to tell us anything. And so it's really important that we practice and learn how to break down those barriers, how to build trust. You know, I've seen in my years of training and practice, patients sadly have been disregarded because maybe they don't want to share. And usually I've found when patients don't want to share, it's because they've had some sort of trauma in their life, or they are not trusting of us or people in general. And it takes time. Sometimes it takes multiple visits. Sometimes it means I'm shouted at and yelled at, and that's okay. I don't take that personally. And I can think of many patients I've taken care of in the past that have sometimes been sort of disregarded, but I recognize that they've probably had some trauma in their life. And it's been thought, well, they don't want to get care, or they don't want to do this, or they don't want to do that. And that's not the case. And I can think of one patient in particular who had several pregnancies where I've taken care of her over the years, didn't come for prenatal care. And her most recent pregnancy, she came to every single visit with me, has continued to see me for GYN care. And it's because I was able to build trust. She's had lots of trauma in her life from a very young age. So why would she trust me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just a product of the system who's did wrong by her like for years. And so it's important that we have an understanding of that. And often the patients who don't talk to us are the patients that need us the most. And that's often what I try in my teaching, I think sometimes the patients who are calling all the time are asking lots of questions. They still need us. Every patient needs us. But sometimes I think we do less for the patients who are not as demanding, and those patients often, I think, maybe need us even more. We have to do a little bit more, and we need to be doing that.
Okay. For people who are looking to be someone's support person, like a doula, or just, be an advocate for them in the room, maybe they don't have anyone else, where do they start? Like, do they read somewhere? Is there a website? Where do they get information?
I think one source where you can get information that's sort of patient-centered to understand pregnancy is like the American College of OBGYN has lots of patient resources that describe various conditions in pregnancy. So if you're looking to understand, pregnancy and some of the complications that occur, I mean, you can Google stuff, but it's hard to know what's accurate and what's not. And so I think it's acog.org, American College of OBGYN, and they have lots of patient resources that I think can be very helpful. So that would be one place that I would recommend going to for information, talking to your midwife or physician. They often will have resources in the office that they can just give to you to learn more about your medical condition, and just asking questions. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And I say that because even sometimes my parents, I'm like, did you ask? And they're like, no, we didn't ask. Like, no, ask questions. It's good. You should have questions for the doctor. If you don't get the response, or you're made to feel like, why did you ask that? That's a problem. Because I often ask patients, not do you have questions, but what questions do you have for me? Because I think that just shifts the assumption. By asking what questions, I think the assumption is, I expect you to ask me questions. I want you to feel safe and comfortable to ask me questions. And so it's never wrong to ask questions, no matter what the situation is. If, your goal is to make sure your loved one is safe. So I think getting armed with information and feeling comfortable asking questions.
We haven't talked about like high risk pregnancies yet. Do they have the same options or opportunities for, advocates, or like sticking to a birth plan? Like, what does that look like for someone with a high risk pregnancy?
Yeah, it really just depends, because high risk pregnancy is such a broad term, and there are various medical issues or various situations where a pregnancy might be high risk, where you might even need to see a doctor that has done a fellowship or specialized training after residency, specifically called a maternal fetal medicine specialist. And they kind of manage more complex high risk pregnancies, usually with an OBGYN. So it's not like one answer specifically, but just because someone has a high risk pregnancy doesn't mean they can't have a doula. Doesn't mean that they necessarily have to have a C-section, doesn't mean they shouldn't have a birth plan. And a birth plan is just, a way of documenting what your desires and wishes are. And so, I really encourage patients to have birth plans, and then for us to go over it at a visit before your full term, before maybe you're going to have your baby, so that we can review. And often I find that a lot of things in the birth plan are things we standardly do, and patients just don't know. I think there's sometimes some stigma with having a hospital birth, or feelings of maybe I'm not going to have the birth experience that I want. But having the patient coming in with a birth plan and us being able to have a conversation, and sometimes I have to say, well, because of this issue during your pregnancy, I don't think this is feasible, but here's maybe what we can do instead. And it's really important, as much as possible, to have that conversation before you come in to have your baby, if you can. That's not always possible for various reasons. But if you can have that conversation before you come in to have your baby, then that's a really stressful time when you come in to have your baby. And so if you have had that conversation, understanding of, well, what is possible, what might not be possible. And I always tell patients, our goal is healthy mom, healthy baby. And in my mind, like, however we get there, it might not be the path that you wanted. But look, I try and have really realistic conversations and expectations. And that doesn't prepare for, like Asiah was saying, emergencies happen, things happen. But I think having that conversation early on can maybe mitigate some of the trauma and stress patients experience after the fact.
So I think there was research that said, women of African descent outside of the U.S. have better, like, maternal health outcomes than women within the U.S. So, there's a lot of medical tourism going on now just because of costs. If a Black woman were to go to a country, that had better prenatal care or, longer maternity leave or whatever is different, that makes pregnancies in those countries healthier or safer than the ones here, would we see a reversal in, or not a reversal, but maybe a slowing down of some of the maternal health outcomes that we see here in the U.S.?
That's a really good question, right? Because there's so many factors at play, right? So there are places where Black women have better health outcomes, right? But we also see in the U.S. that foreign-born Black women who have immigrated to the U.S. have better health outcomes, have better birth outcomes, right? And part of that is in sociology, we call this the immigrant health paradox, right? So if we're looking at a population of people who are born outside of the U.S., who migrated to the U.S., chances are they're going to have better health than people who were born in the U.S., right? And part of that is linked to a selection effect in terms of who migrates to the U.S., right? So if you are a family who is sending someone to the U.S. for better opportunities, and they're going to send money back, or they're going to be the first person there, and then everyone's going to migrate after, you're going to send your best and your brightest and your healthiest and your strongest, right? And so we're getting, in terms of immigrants, we're getting somewhat the cream of the crop. We're getting the healthiest, we're getting younger people, right? And they are then having, health outcomes, birth outcomes in the U.S. that will be better, right? Also, you might see that there are people who are outside of the U.S. who are not subject to the same level of racism throughout their life and that same stress. And so that might be why they're having better outcomes, right? So if we take Black women, a 30-year-old Black women who have lived in the U.S. their whole lives, experienced U.S. anti-Black woman racism, and send them overseas, we're not necessarily going to see better outcomes, right? Because you're still having that racism, that stress on your body, right? Also, in other countries, right? And part of something else about the immigrant health paradox is that other countries might be healthier than the US, period, right? So like one of the things we found for the immigrant health paradox was that, we were getting immigrants from countries where smoking is not a thing, right? Whereas in the US, smoking is a thing. You get people who are smoking, they start at young ages, that has a health impact, right? And so it's really, really hard to say that if we were just to take Black women and, like, let's say the government started a program and said, look, okay, Black women, you want to go overseas and give birth, let's go. It's hard to say that, right? It's really, really hard to compare health systems in that way, right? And then it's also hard to say if we did that for all Black women, because we might be sending them to a country where after a while they might develop some anti-Black racism, right? And that might start to play out in their health system, right? And so, it's very tempting to want to say, let's just go to another country, but every Black woman can't do that, right? And so what we need are better health systems in America for all women, right? Especially Black women, so that we can have better health outcomes.
But unfortunately, I think I have to have the unfortunate position of saying that we are out of time.
Yeah.
This is my least favorite part of these conversations because they're so wonderful. And I will tell you that Tiana and I still have about 25 questions that we haven't even got to, let alone what we're getting from just the conversation. So we'll probably have you back.
Great.
I do want to take a moment and just acknowledge two people. First of all, Audrey Lau from the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, who is backstage doing our tech for us today. So thank you so much, Audrey. And then also Tiana, who's been our host today, is also the person who conceptualized and put together this whole event. So Tiana, this was really awesome. And I really want to acknowledge that. Thank you so much. For all of you who are watching at home, thank you so much for being with us. You are the reason that we do what we do. You are absolutely wonderful. I love the engagement in the chat. I love that you're with us. So thank you so much for being here. We do have a lot of other great programs coming up, including another Lunch and Learn. There is a little teeny tiny break before the next one. It's not till August 20th. And then we are talking about human trafficking. And actually today is World Human Trafficking Day today. But come join us on August 20th as we do a Lunch and Learn about human trafficking awareness. You can also visit our website at civilrights.mypgc.us. I'm not sure I could have said that faster. But if you go there, you can scroll down to the bottom. You'll see our events. And please also visit our friends, the library system, our co-host for this event at pgcmls.info/events. And you'll see all the wonderful programs they have coming, and they have many every single day. And then Asiah, Dr. Kitessa, it was so wonderful to have you. Like you have so much information, so much knowledge. You're doing so much incredible work in your communities, advocating, sharing information for us. And we appreciate the work that you're doing and also the time that you chose to spend with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
It was wonderful.
We really loved it. Thank you so much. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody, but please, we'll see you all again soon.
Bye.